Okay, folks, thank you for bearing with me this week. Apologies for the lateness. This is actually going to be your only lecture for the week. Unfortunately, I discovered that my lecture on Viking reception from the last time I taught this course was almost entirely media-based, which is not going to work over Zoom. But on the bright side, that's one less lecture that you have to watch this week. Okay, so this is From Odin to Christ, the Christianization of Scandinavia. Alright, so we're going to begin with a little bit of background on early missionary work. The first relevant missionary was Willibrod. He was an Englishman who worked mostly in Frisia, which is a coastal area on the North Sea. Now, he visited the Danish king Onegundus in around 700. We know he had no luck, and he went home fairly quickly with 30 boys that had been given to him. Presumably he was hoping to train them to preach in the Danish tongue to their own people. But it was over 100 years before missionaries returned to Denmark. Now, Harold, who had been helped back to power by the Danes in 819, opened the door for Abo of Rem to leave a mission. So what happened was in 826, King Harold, in order to secure continued Frankish support, accepted baptism at Mainz, with the Frankish Emperor Louis the Pious serving as his sponsor. He returned to Denmark, accompanied by a number of people from the south, including a monk called Ansgar. But a year later he was expelled from his kingdom and spent the rest of his life in exile. Now, in 829, a king of the sphere, who occupied what is now eastern Sweden, asked Louis to send preachers to Birka. Ansgar, who had already had experience in the north, was chosen for this. He came home after about 18 months and claimed to have made a good beginning. He had converted a nobleman he called the prefect of Birka, who built a church on his own land. In reward, Ansgar was given the newly created See of Hamburg, which was soon raised to an archbishopric by the Pope. The Pope also gave Ansgar joint authority with Abo, and I quote, amongst the sphere, Danes, Slavs, and other people inhabiting the northern regions. Now, missionaries who were working in the north in this period faced a situation where their potential converts were willing to accept Christ, but only as one God amongst many. In order for them to give him any greater status, they had to be shown that he was particularly useful. So there was a story in an early piece of hagiography about a raiding party of Swedes. Now, they decided to try casting lots to see if Christ would help them. And then when he did, they repaid him with a 40-day fast. And it was 40 days because they'd heard about Lent. So they figured he liked 40-day fasts. Now, Ansgar's Vita, which was written by a converted Dane, Bert, was full of stories like this. Christianity's successes under Ansgar follow episodes of divination and testing. Now, because conversion becomes a local thing, the role of the kings is initially diminished in comparison to elsewhere in Europe. That, of course, is going to change. Now, that being said, in 845, Ansgar faced a very serious setback. A fleet led by the Danish king sacked Hamburg and destroyed his cathedral. So because he had been preaching Christianity as a religion of power and success, this sort of demonstration of failure probably raised doubts. And it's weird, though, because 845 also was a significant date for him in other ways. There was a fatal disease that affected some of the Danes who had attacked Paris in that year. Some of them, including their leader, Ragnar, survived for long enough to return home and tell the king what had happened. And Ragnar attributed his illness to the power of Saint Germain, whose monastery they had sacked. And so when Ragnar and many of his companions died, the king was so frightened that he had the survivors executed, and he returned all the Christians captured in the raids on Hamburg and Paris to their own countries. So it's kind of interesting that on one hand, the sack of Hamburg was a bad sign for Ansgar as a converter of Danes, but the fate of those who attacked Paris was sort of a counter demonstration. And this led King Hork eventually to accept Ansgar. Now, he was received on friendly terms by the king, who allowed him to build a church at Hedeby. And the existence of this church actually stimulated trade, because Christian merchants could now go to Hedeby without fear, because they knew there was, at least a little bit of a Christian community there to welcome them. Now, he dies, Ansgar, in 865, and unfortunately the next major contemporary source for Scandinavia and its conversion comes from 200 years later, Adam of Bremen's Gesta. Now, he is writing specifically to justify the claims of his archbishopric to lead the church in Scandinavia. He has little to say about the rest of the 10th century. He mentions a few bishops very briefly. So he mentions that in 936, another archbishop, Uni, visited Burka and died there, but his purpose is not known. He might have been trying to revive lapsed mission. Now, his successor, Adeldag, consecrated bishops for a number of northern cities, sometime just before 948, not to have, increased missionary activity, but to have the suffragans he needed, the lesser bishops, to maintain his archiepiscopal status. So these bishops, in most cases, would never go to Denmark. They would never establish sees. The only exception that we know of is Leofdag, who was the bishop of Ribe, and he is said to have preached in Sweden and Norway, which suggests that he was a missionary bishop. Now, Odense is named as a bishopric in an imperial diploma from 988. We know that it was a sort of cult center for pre-Christian religion, may also have been a royal center. So it makes sense that this might have been the base for a missionary bishop. We don't actually have any evidence for a regular episcopal see there, or anywhere else in Scandinavia before the time of Canute. So really, this early phase of missionary work and Christianization is very difficult to track. The reason for this is because we're looking at many different takes on what it meant to be Christian or to adopt Christian beliefs. Christianization is always very gradual, and that makes its early phases, especially in a culture like this, very difficult to really grasp. Okay, so there is some indication that the toleration of Christian missionaries shown to those in Ansgar's time by kings of the Danes and of the Sphere was continued by at least some of their 10th century successors. So some Scandinavians were prepared to accept that Christ was a god, even if they weren't ready to accept that he was the only god. The German chronicler Widukind, who was writing about a century after Ansgar's death, said, quote, "The Danes have long been Christians, but they nevertheless worshipped idols with pagan rituals." So basically, something was going on. They may not have fully committed themselves to Christianity, but they were carrying out Christian practices. Now, the conversions of Scandinavians in the 9th century probably happened mostly in Western Europe. Oftentimes when Viking leaders came to terms with Christian rulers, they would accept baptism. These conversions are not usually permanent, and one Frankish archbishop complained that converts who reverted to pagan ways were, quote, behaving like typical Northmen. But some of them would have been sincere, and by the beginning of the 10th century, most of the Scandinavians who'd settled in Western Europe, or at least their descendants, were as Christian as their neighbors who had been there all along. Toleration of missionaries in the 9th and early 10th century prepared the way for the next stage of Christianization, which was the formal acceptance of the exclusive claims of the Christian God, so the abandonment of traditional cults, or conversely, their reduction to superstitions. And to do this, you actually needed support from the kings, because otherwise this wasn't going to work. Now, the first king to be baptized in Scandinavia was Harald Bluetooth, who proclaimed on his runic monument at Jelling that he had, quote, made the Danes Christian. Now, he did this without consulting a missionary, or so our sources tell us. His own conversion, which happened in about 965, was widely believed to have been brought about by a priest proving that Christ was the one true God by a miracle that somehow involved an ordeal by hot iron. Now, according to Widukind, who was writing in 968, the king converted, decided that Christ alone should be worshipped as God, ordered all people subject to him to reject idols, and gave due honor to priests and God's servants. Some Danes continued to sacrifice to their old gods, but not for long. By the end of the century, for instance, we no longer see pagan-style burials. Okay, Harold was succeeded by his son, Svein Forkbeard. And Adam of Bremen claimed that Svein began his reign as an apostate, and that the revolt against Harold had been a heathen reaction to his Christianization. There's no actual evidence to support this, and we know that a church was built in Lund sometime just before or after 990, so that suggests that Adam was wrong. Svein's refusal to accept that the archbishops of Hamburg and Bremen had any authority over the Danish church was probably why Adam treated him like an enemy. But really, later in his reign, even Adam had to admit that Svein was a Christian king and worked on the conversion of Norway. So what this tells us is that missionary narratives can't really be taken 100% seriously because there are always political agendas at play. Now, his successor, Canute, whom we know was a generous benefactor of churches on the continent as well as in England, and was the first Scandinavian king to visit Rome, actually recruited several English bishops to work in Denmark. And presumably because of his experiences in England, he started to create regular dioceses. So England helps evangelize Scandinavia, just like it had helped evangelize other northern areas on the continent. Now, at least one Norwegian king had publicly acknowledged Christianity earlier than this, and that was Harald Finehair, who had sent his son Hakon to be fostered by the English king Athelstan. This was an arrangement that had political and diplomatic purposes, but it had religious consequences as well. He succeeded his father, Hakon, and he was the first king that apparently encouraged Christianity in Norway. He may even have invited English missionaries in. There was some claim that he got himself into trouble because he didn't want to take part in the traditional sacrifices too. Now, Snorri would go on to say that Hakon had abandoned Christianity and been given a pagan burial, and this is actually supported by the skaldic poem that was composed after Hakon died fighting his Christian nephews. The poet described Hakon as a heathen who faced Odin's hostility in Valhalla because he'd failed Odin, but he was accepted because he'd not been hostile to the traditional religion. So what does this imply? Well, maybe that Hakon at least had accepted Christianity personally, but hadn't made any effort to impose it on his people. So the religious situation in Norway was probably similar to what we saw in Denmark, but in Norway, in large parts of Norway at least, pagan burial customs were abandoned earlier. Basically, in the coastal regions, the proportion of burials furnished with grave goods was declining already in the first half of the 10th century. I mean, what happens is that all of this early progress in Norway gets obscured because there's so much emphasis put on Olaf Tryggvason. So this narrative, like so many other narratives, falls victim to the great man theory. Now, Olaf imposes Christianity very violently, beginning in the area around Trondheim on the independent farmers there. I mean, he dispossessed and attacked and even blinded people who resisted him. The traditions in the sagas are a little bit, again, be skeptical about them. But we do know that the court poets who had been making use of all the traditional mythical material earlier in his reign started not to do that anymore. So, there were reasons that he did it the way that he did. we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the readings. Now in Sweden, Olaf Skotkonung was later recognized as the first Christian king, but it's likely that the traditional date, 1008, for his conversion was too late, because we know he was already issuing Christian coins by 995 that were marked with Olaf Rex. We do know, though, that pagan cults continued to be celebrated at Uppsala until 1080. He doesn't snap his fingers and turn Sweden Christian. It's much more of a process. We have to concede that, it may have actually been done out of religious feeling, because he doesn't seem to have used it as a political tool. Now, you have the conversion of the Icelanders, which we've talked about briefly elsewhere, and we'll talk about that reading at class. So, in general, what does Christianity look like in Scandinavia? By the end of the 11th century, it had begun to affect all levels of Scandinavian society. Numerous churches had been built, most of them by landowners, and they had installed clergy who were in effect their servants. Bishops were responsible for the consecration of churches and the coordination of services, ordination of clergy. So they're able to ensure that church buildings and their fittings conform to the law of the church. So patrons of churches and their clergy were not free to design churches as they liked. The first churches were timber structures, most of which left few traces, but most were rebuilt in stone in the 12th century. So they're very similar to contemporary rural churches in England and Germany. So that's an indicator that we see similar building styles, and that Scandinavia is becoming more integrated. The church introduced a new language, Latin, to Scandinavia, and a new script, the alphabet. Brought new forms of worship, liturgical manuscripts, Christian literature of a type that had never actually been seen in Scandinavia before. They had the Bible, Lives of Saints, letter collections, chronicles. They used them to help educate future clergy, and eventually they would provide models for native literature as well. In Norway and in Iceland in particular, these types of pieces of religious literature were often translated right away into the vernacular, and they were written in an insular script, as it's called, that reveals English influence. Most of the early bishops in Scandinavia were foreigners. Many of them were from England or Germany. A lot of them had some experience with government, and they taught Scandinavians to use documents as evidence of grants or other transactions. They're also largely responsible for compiling the first written laws. So by doing that, they're also beginning to modify traditional customs to fit the law of the church. Now, church law is not always accepted widely in Scandinavia. Certain things that were, however, was a new rule that gifts could be made by the dying without the consent of heirs, and that all children, including unmarried daughters, were entitled to a fixed share of an inheritance. The reason for this on the part of the church is very, selfish. They wanted women as well as men to be able to give to the church. We know that these laws were accepted because they're written down in runic inscriptions, for instance. We don't have written versions of them, like manuscript versions of them, till the 12th century, but certainly the changes date back earlier than that. Now, runic inscriptions also tell us that women play a major role in religious life, just as they do elsewhere in Europe. There is one stone in Uppland that was erected by two brothers in memory of their parents, and it ends, "May God now help her soul well," suggesting that only their mother was Christian. Now, it's significant that most of the monuments commemorating deathbed converts were actually erected by women. So, for instance, there are 6 inscriptions in Uppland in memory of men who, quote, died in white clothing, and 5 of them were erected by women. So their wives celebrating that their husbands converted on their deathbed, or that family members converted on their deathbed. Now, women are also mentioned in stones that refer to the building of bridges. So why is this important? Because missionaries teach that building a bridge is a meritorious act that earned divine favor, because it's connecting people to each other. So there are about 120 bridge inscriptions that we know of, and a lot of them were commissioned by women. If you compare, 1 in 14 of all inscriptions are in memory of women. A quarter of the bridge stones commemorate women who raised bridges. So there's something about the raising of bridges that they were particularly into. Now, I just thought I'd close us off with a couple of images. So this is the interior of the Borgund Stave Church, or part of the interior, rather, just to give you a sense of what it actually looks like. Of course, all the decoration is considerably later, but you get a basic sense of the size. Okay, so that is your lecture for this week. Again, I'm sorry about not having the other, but when it's that much media, there is no actual point to trying to do it over Zoom. I hadn't realized it was so focused on media. So we'll talk about the readings, and I'll see if I can't scrape something together about Viking video games for you for next week. All right, have a good evening, folks.